What happens in Canada is interesting. We have the greatest concentration of ownership of the media in any major Western democracy by far. Not only is it a concentration of ownership of the media, but it is a cross-ownership as well, where in many markets, the same people own the television stations and own the newspapers as well, which is something that would not be allowed in most other Western democracies. So you get a situation like New Brunswick or Saskatchewan or Vancouver, British Columbia, where you essentially get one voice and only one voice. And the people who own most of these newspapers and most of these television stations are not only conservative and not only far right-wing, but they're falling off the right edge of the globe. They're very, very conservative people. So a Conrad Black or an Izzy Asper goes out and hires a very, very conservative newspaper publisher. And the very conservative newspaper publisher then goes out and hires a very conservative newspaper editor. And the very conservative newspaper editor then goes out and hires very conservative newspaper columnists. So you tend to get a steady stream of stuff that doesn't reflect the opinion of average Canadians.
The handful of corporations listed here control the spin on almost all the news and information available to Canadians. Alternative voices are silenced or dismissed. The press versus the people. That runs right to the heart of the debate over the future of our country and to the heart of politics. A 2006 Senate report on the media notes that no real democracy can function without a healthy, diverse, and independent news media to inform people about the way their society works. The argument is that in a democracy, government should foster healthy and independent news media.
One of the interesting things I've found over the years, the National Post/Financial Post publishes polls about every couple of weeks on the views of leading chief executive officers in Canada, and they ask some questions. What do you think of this? What do you think about that? And consistently, as sure as we're here in this room together tonight, consistently, the opinions of the CEOs are incredibly different than the opinions of the majority of Canadians. I'll just give you one recent example. What would you like to cut government spending? Which area would you like to cut government spending by most of all? And the CEOs said social spending. And the average Canadian says, well, we really need to increase our social spending in Canada, which is true, and I'll give you some stats on that in a moment. So you would get reflected in our media the views of the Neanderthals at the Fraser Institute or the C.D. Howe Institute or the terribly awful Canadian Council of Chief Executives.
The Neanderthal Institute of Canada is a clearinghouse for American administration-approved dysfunctional social policies, such as too much spending on the environment, health care, education, social programs, and so on. And, of course, too much taxation. And not enough spending on national defense, the protection of private property, and law enforcement. According to founder Michael Walker, the Fraser Institute is devoted to researching the use of markets, how markets work, and how markets fail. The C.D. Howe Institute is funded almost exclusively from Bay Street. The Canadian Council of Chief Executives is almost certainly the most continentalist corporate organization in modern Canadian history. It was the private sector leader in both the development and aggressive promotion of FTA, NAFTA, and now the the Security and Prosperity Partnership.
Reporters, columnists, they get handed the stuff from the C.D. Howe Institute, from the Fraser Institute, from the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, from the ridiculous Conference Board of Canada, and the next day it's on the front page of the paper. Or if it's not on the front page of the paper, it's on the front page of the business section of the paper. Conversely, if the reporters get material from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives or the Canadian Social Welfare Council, or etc., always preceded by the left leaning. They don't say the Fraser Institute is falling off the right edge of the globe and things like that, but the others are all left-leaning. Their stuff is either not published, or some of it is published, or a couple of paragraphs will appear next to the comic book section of the newspapers. So Canadians are misled almost every day on a daily basis in the stuff that they read. And I put together this book after 3.5 years of research with the view in mind to say, hey, this isn't really what is happening in our country.
This program uses data from Statistics Canada and numerous OECD comparison studies. For over 40 years, the OECD has been one of the world's largest, most reliable sources of comparable statistics and unbiased and nonpartisan economic and social data. The 30 countries listed below are the members of the OECD.
I love this country. I've always loved this country. I think we're incredibly lucky to live in this country. People coming from Asia, for instance, driving between Calgary and Winnipeg, they can't believe the space that we've got in this country. They can't believe the agricultural land that we have. They can't believe the water that we have in this country. They can't believe the natural resources that we have in this country. And many people coming from other countries can't believe the relatively well-educated population we've got in this country. We can have the best and the finest, the nicest, the most tolerant, the most socially conscious country in the entire world. But if we elect a Harper majority government this time, what he's going to do is sure, again, as we're in this room together, will be to take steps to create new Northern Balkan states in North America, to devolve powers to the provincial governments, even though the provincial governments, contrary to the myth that exists in this country, this is one of the most decentralized democracies anywhere. Washington, D.C. spends much, much more percentage of government spending than the states and the municipalities do than Canada. So, but Harper wants to go further than that and weaken the national government of Canada.
Where Ottawa was once receiving over 65% of all government revenue in Canada, as the pie shows, beginning in the 1960s and in every decade thereafter, the federal government's share of all government income has been shrinking. It now receives less than 40%, a huge drop. This OECD comparison study shows the percentage of tax revenue received by national governments. As you can see, Canada is way down on the list. How can a national government implement and maintain national programs without sufficient revenue? These conservative government programs seem to be all but designed to emphasize regional differences. They allow any province to opt out, yet receive full compensation and proceed to set their own rules and standards. Under this regime, new national programs of consequence are all but impossible.
Weaken the national government, goodbye new social spending, and goodbye similar good programs for the benefit of our country. Of the 30 OECD countries, we're 25th in social spending. There's 24 other OECD countries that spend more than we do in social spending.
If Canada's social spending rose just to match the average spent by the countries of the European Union, we would have an additional $95 billion for social spending in many areas of our economy. So the argument that social programs should be cut is ridiculous. Public opinion polls consistently show that the majority of Canadians put social programs at or near the top of their list of priorities, far ahead of tax cuts, debt repayment, or defense spending.
Why is this happening? To answer this very important question, to see how we have arrived at where we are today, we need to take a brief detour through history. After the Great Depression and the war years, the Keynesian revolution swept the West. The publication in Canada in 1945 of the White Paper on Employment and Income and the Green Book, an outline of the government's social welfare planning, confirmed that the Keynesian consensus had been accepted by Canadian governments at that time and through the 60s. The consensus considered government intervention to be necessary in order to protect and maintain the welfare of Canada and its citizens. Trudeau, on behalf of Canadians, refused to get involved in attacks against Cuba and in the Vietnam War. And he made no bones about his dislike for Ronald Reagan. When asked what he thought about Brian Mulroney, he replied that with all the checks and balances in our parliamentary system, we had overlooked one thing: the election of a wimp. By a wimp we mean a Canadian leader unwilling to say no to U.S. administration demands. One wimp was bad enough. 4 in a row, with no end in sight, has moved Canada to the point of no return. These bad choices are typical of neoliberalism, which reflects the so-called Washington Consensus, which maintains that government control over the economy is inefficient, corrupt, or otherwise undesirable, almost a direct antithesis to the Keynesian consensus, which claims that, on the contrary, an enlightened government can use its influence in the economy to stabilize total output at the full employment capacity level. And from the 1940s through the 60s, that did prove to be the case. Let's finish off our brief historical detour. During the 1980s Reagan and Thatcher years, Canada was steadily drawn into the Washington Consensus, and neoliberalism dominates political discourse and policy today. In fact, we've already seen 2 of them in action. The move towards less government in Canada through a decentralized federal government, and how federal social programs have indeed been weakened in step with the neoliberal notion that they are too costly. Let's take a closer look at the results of neoliberal policies on we the people of Canada. In GDP per capita, Canada stands 9th of all OECD countries. But per capita figures can be misleading. If, for example, you have 11 individuals, 10 of whom make $10,000 per year, and 1 who makes $1 million, the per capita figure is $100,000 per year, which sounds impressive. but it masks the distribution of wealth. This Statistics Canada survey chart says it all. 70% of the wealth in Canada belongs to the top 20% of Canadians. 80% of Canadians have access to the 30% leftovers. The bottom 40%, close to half of all Canadians, have access to only 2.4% of all wealth. A pie chart reflects this disparity even more dramatically.
What's the reason that we have so much poverty in this country?
Currently, 21 of the 30 OECD countries have lower poverty rates than Canada.
Well, of all the OECD countries, we have one of the highest rates of low-pay jobs. 21% of the jobs in Canada, you know, we've got a low unemployment rate, but there's a problem there. 21% of the jobs in this country are low-pay jobs. In the European Union, it's only between 8 and 12%. But then, you know, we do have unemployment insurance, which is ridiculously called employment insurance now. In 1980, 86% of unemployed Canadians received unemployment insurance. Now it's under 40% of Canadians. And of the 30 OECD countries, we are 22nd in how unemployment insurance reimburses people for their lost income. Now, I'm sure all of you saw the Statistics Canada reports recently about the distribution of income in Canada and how the broad middle class ain't going anywhere and hasn't been going anywhere for a quarter of a century, for 25 years. The broad middle class is going nowhere. The lowest group of Canadians were losing income, and of course, the highest paid CEOs were getting millions of dollars. Disparity in distribution of income in this country now is greater than it has been at any time in the last 30 years. The lowest 94% of all families in Canada owns the grand total of 3% of family wealth in this country. What has that got to do with democracy?
A 2003 UN Human Development Report, considering the percentage of population below the poverty line, places Canada almost at the bottom.
To a far greater extent than in the past, the issue of economic justice and income distribution is off the radar screen of our politicians, leaving huge numbers living in poverty. We are struck by the way in which the minimum wage was deliberately allowed to fall, despite the fact that the minimum wage plays a key social and anti-poverty role. Workers' wages have not risen for years. Not so, however, for corporate profits, which we shall take a look at in a moment.
Wouldn't you think then that our welfare payments to underprivileged people would be reasonably high, or at least reasonable compared to other developed countries? Welfare payments in Canada in this year are going to be well below the level of welfare payments in Canada way back in 1980.
Thomas Walkom writes that the plight of those on welfare in Canada is shameful. It is criminal. Successive governments have gutted or eliminated much of Canada's vaunted social safety net.
I wrote that book, Pay the Rent or Feed the Kids, after traveling across Canada and studying poverty in this country, and the title came from a very simple place. Almost every time I visited families, I heard people saying, Mel, we're really trying to figure out whether this month, it's the end of the month, we can afford to pay the rent or whether we can afford to feed our children. And that's ridiculous. That's awful. In a country like this, as I said, we have such a disparity of income in this country. We shouldn't have that situation in this country.
Canada is the only G8 country without a national housing strategy. Worse, there is a lack of political will to develop one, despite a growing homelessness crisis and huge waiting lists for subsidized housing across the country.
The Mulroney government cut spending on federal housing by $2 billion. The Chrétien government downloaded housing to the provinces. The Martin government abolished the housing ministry. And there is nothing forthcoming from the current Harper government. The first food bank opened in Edmonton in 1981. It was thought to be a temporary measure. By 1988, there were 159 food banks across Canada, and in 2008, 649. These food banks, servicing the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable in our society, get no or very little help from government agencies. Do we have enough doctors? During the years 1990 to 2004, in terms of the number of doctors per 100,000 people, Canada stood far down the list of all countries in an appalling 54th place. And following from this, it should come as no surprise that only 4 countries are worse in their infant mortality rate than Canada. In continental Europe, poverty has been reduced by 40% through social spending. In the Nordic countries and the Netherlands, the impact has been even greater.
In Canada in 1989, we had a unanimous all-party resolution in the House of Commons saying we're going to abolish poverty in this country by the year 2000. You remember that? Well, in the 19 years since then, our gross domestic product in Canada has more than doubled. It's increased by a massive $900 and something billion. Very nice. Child poverty in Canada, in that 19 years, the rate is exactly the same as it was back then when we said we were going to abolish child poverty. In terms of adult poverty, Canada in 2007 had the 9th largest gross domestic product of any country in the world.
How disgraceful it is for Canada, with the 9th highest GDP per capita, to be so uncaring in the welfare of its own men, women, and children compared to so many other developed countries.
To combat poverty in Canada, we could raise the minimum wages or provide an earned income supplement. We could stop taxing people with very low income, revitalize the unemployment insurance program, stop provincial clawbacks of child benefits, create affordable rental housing programs, increase social assistance benefits, expand job training, develop a workable child care program, provide more funds for university tuitions. In a predominantly neoliberal climate, such policies will not be implemented anytime soon. Let's pause for a moment to evaluate the neoliberal principles mentioned earlier. After all, they are the basis for much of our current social policy. But do they work? It is not so that higher productivity requires lower taxes and less government. During the 1990s, Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands, among other countries, retained high taxes for funding strong social programs. And their productivity increases equaled or exceeded those of the United States and Canada. This nostrum is false. When governments slashed billions of dollars from social programs during the 1990s, volunteerism in Canada declined. Citizen participation is stronger in Scandinavian countries, which have the world's strongest equalizing social programs. Unregulated markets make for less inequality and poverty. Well, the reverse is so. High levels of deregulated economic growth in Canada have been accompanied by an increase in inequality and poverty. It is not so that universal social programs are too costly, inefficient, and reduce competitiveness. Instead of universal social programs reducing a nation's economic competitiveness, in many cases they actually improve it. There is empirical evidence, for example, that Medicare gives us a competitive edge in attracting new investment. In what way is universal health care unsustainable? After all, government spending on health as a percentage of the GDP is lower today than it was a decade ago. If we want to improve the system, as the Romano Commission has shown, we simply need to restore much of what the federal government cut in the 1990s. As this chart shows, there has been a significant shift in tax burden from corporations to individuals.
Let's talk for a minute about corporate profits. The graph of corporate taxes in this country goes straight downhill at a 45-degree angle. And interestingly enough, if you compare how corporate taxes have descended into the basement, all you have to do is look at the annual reports of the World Economic Forum on competitiveness, and as corporate taxes went like this, Canada's competitive rate went like this as well. Instead of us becoming more competitive, the competitiveness of Canadian business is headed towards the bottom. Corporate profits in Canada in 1992 were 4.7% of gross domestic product. In 2007, they were 16% of GDP. Corporate profits in Canada have been higher in this country than in the U.S. for 16 of the last 24 years. And now corporate taxes in Canada are well below the level of American corporate taxes, and they're headed even lower thanks to Stephen Harper. Well, at the same time, we now know that for the last 4 consecutive years, corporate profits in Canada have been all-time record profits. So what has corporate Canada done with their enormous profits that they've made for the last 4 years? Have they invested in new machinery and equipment? Have they done more research and development to make us more innovative, to make us more competitive? Have they produced more patents? Well, the answer to each question is no way. Investment in new machinery and equipment in Canada during these 4 all-time record years of corporate profits puts us in 18th place in the OECD. The 17 countries do a better job than we do. And in research and development by industry, we are in a dandy 25th place. Patents per million people of the 30 OECD countries were in 30th place. And productivity now, again, I can't stress enough, that any economist at the University of Toronto will tell you productivity is the key to our success in the future. And in a list of 50 countries, our productivity record is 47th of 50 countries. In corporate taxes now, we're 27th of 30 OECD countries. That's how high they are. And in overall taxes, we are 21st out of 30 in our tax burden overall, including all kinds of taxes, provincial taxes, income taxes, GST, property taxes, etc. So the next time you hear somebody say, oh, we're too heavily taxed in this country, you ask them, compared to where? Yeah, we are compared to the United States, but how would you like to have the tens of millions of men, women, and children with no health insurance whatsoever? How would you like to have the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of personal and family bankruptcies every single year because people can't afford to pay their medical bills? How would you like to have the incredible absence of social programs that exist in the United States compared to almost every other developed country? One of the things you'll find as you examine the annual publications of the OECD is that by any social calculus that you want, any denominator that you want to measure, the United States and Mexico is at the bottom of the 30 nations barrel, especially in terms of poverty and child poverty and etc. I don't know about you, but that's not the kind of country that I want to live in myself. Public expenditures on education as a percentage of gross domestic product were 57th. 57th. Public expenditures on education as a percentage of all government spending, are you ready for this? We're 91st. Now, what kind of future can we look forward to with numbers like that?
There are more jobs in Canadian cultural industries than in agriculture, mining, and forestry combined. Yet major components of our cultural industry have been or are being sold off. 89% of Canadians say the CBC helps distinguish Canada from the United States. But the CBC's budget is cut by $400 million. This is no way to maintain a Canadian identity.
Canadians owe the Aboriginal peoples of Canada a debt they can never repay. It is primarily due to the great Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, one of the greatest military commanders in the history of North America, that we have a country at all. In the War of 1812, against overwhelming American forces, the British General Isaac Brock had enough sense to listen to Tecumseh. As a result, the Americans were defeated. And so we must reclaim the true history of our roots, our origins. In fact, there are not two, as is usually stated, but three founding peoples of Canada: the British, the French, and the native peoples of Canada. How do we repay the debt we owe our native peoples? The recent apology for the cultural genocide perpetrated on them throughout the 20th century was only a beginning,
and for this,
not an end.
We are sorry. There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. You have been working on recovering from this experience for a long time. And in a very real sense, we are now joining you on this journey. The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
When we look at Aboriginal peoples in Canada, they make up 3.8% of the population, but 20% of the prison population. The Kelowna Accord, given universal approval, was junked by the Harper government.
About 100 First Nations communities must boil their water. The 23% unemployment rate for young Aboriginal workers is double the rate for all young workers. 16% of the general population have not finished high school. 54% of natives on reserves have not finished high school. In 1812, Brock died in the Battle of Queenston Heights, and in 1813, Tecumseh died at the Battle of the Thames. Brock's funeral was described by a contemporary as being the grandest and most solemn that has ever been seen in Upper Canada. Tecumseh, to whom we owe, along with Isaac Brock, the very existence of the Canadian nation, lies somewhere in an unknown and unmarked grave. That, too, is a truth about Canada. The very effective Foreign Investment Review Agency and the National Energy Program, designed to protect key manufacturing, business, and resource sectors of our economy, were scrapped by the Mulroney government. The toothless Investment Canada watchdog, which replaced them in the mid-'80s, has been completely ineffective.
I want to say a few words about foreign investment. Of all the money that the new agency, Investment Canada, monitors for all this foreign direct investment that's come in since FIRA was abolished, $847 billion to the end of March of this year, a crummy 2.4% was for new business investment. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't see how we can be a country and keep selling off our high-tech companies in and around Ottawa or in and around the Fraser Valley or across the country, and our natural resources, excuse me, our oil and gas companies, our manufacturing sector. Our manufacturing sector in Canada is now majority foreign-owned. Our oil and gas sector is now majority foreign-owned. And we've got 36 different sectors of the Canadian economy that are majority foreign-owned and controlled. Anybody want to take a guess as to how many there are in the United States? Zero. There isn't a single sector in the United States economy that is majority foreign-owned and controlled.
The chart says it all. Canada has more of its manufacturing industry under foreign control than any other OECD country.
The Globe and Mail of February the 6th notes that Canada is one of the few Western countries to have never stopped a foreign takeover. The Americans stop them all the time. Why do all other developed countries, except Canada, resist foreign takeovers?
Investment is the term currently used for the acquisition of Canadian companies. But what actually occurs when a Canadian company is acquired by a foreign owner? Management and purchasing decisions are made by the new foreign owners. Research and development is done outside of Canada. Control of the databases and payrolls are shifted out of the country. And transfer pricing occurs. That is, the charging of excessive, exorbitant fees for consultations, services, advertising, and other fees, allowing profits to be transferred out of the country before taxation, thereby further eroding Canada's tax base and shifting ever more of the tax burden onto Canadian workers.
Peter C. Newman sums it up well. In all other developed countries, the economic elite defend their country's sovereignty because not only is it in their own interests to do so, but they are proud of their country and wish it to be more than a place where their children and grandchildren can best look forward to being serfs. Indeed, but it gets worse, much worse.
Leading editorials in the Globe and Mail and et cetera saying the free trade agreement is the basis of our wealth and our economy. And other quotes saying the free trade agreement was instrumental in raising our standard of living, etc. What I did, John...
Mel is referring to the Right Honourable John Turner, Prime Minister of Canada in 1984, who, as leader of the opposition in 1988, gave a truly inspired, impassioned speech on behalf of our country. Here is an excerpt from that speech. Mr. Speaker, we are here today to discuss one of the most devastating pieces of legislation ever brought before the House of Commons, a bill which will finish Canada as we know it. It is a dream come true for the Americans. At long last, they found a government in Ottawa dumb enough, stupid enough, patsies so craven in the face of American demands that they just caved in to every request made of them. I say to the people of Canada, this is not a trade deal. This is the Sale of Canada Act.
I took Statistics Canada documents and I measured the 17 years before the Free Trade Agreement went into effect in 1989. Then I measured the 17 years afterwards. And in every single important economic indicator, in the level of wages, in the capture of the extent of the U.S. market, in the ability of Canadian families to have a higher standard of living, there's a whole long list. In every single one, we did better in the 17 years before free trade than we did in the first 17 years of the Free Trade Agreement.
It's both the imports that are coming into North America and the lack of ability of our vehicle builders to export to China, Asia, and the European community, who all have their markets essentially closed and protected. The Conservative government's Automobile Innovation Fund simply does not address this primary problem. In 2006, Japan produced about 900,000 automobiles in Canada. Their share of the domestic market reached 34%. During the past decade, a consistent picture has been presented by big business, almost all liberal conservative politicians, and the mainstream press that the Free Trade Agreement has been an enormous success, producing, quote, immense economic benefits, a great unquestioned triumph. In the first 3 years of free trade, 1.4 million jobs disappeared. More than 500,000 manufacturing jobs were wiped out. Over 24% of the entire Canadian manufacturing sector. Plant closures continued, including some of the best-known manufacturers in Canada. How many companies has Canada lost? We'll get to that in a moment, along with an explanation of what these losses signify for the Canadian economy. In one 6-month period in 1990, 97 Ontario plants closed or scaled down production. In the first 7 months of 1992, at least 86 plants shut down permanently. By May of '92, over 28% of Ontario's manufacturing sector disappeared in just over 3 years. According to Investment Canada, from 1985 to 2008, 11,043 Canadian-owned companies were acquired by foreign owners. You may verify this at Investment Canada's website. This amounts to some 40 companies per month for 23 years.
The NAFTA agreement, typical cowardly Canadians, don't talk about getting rid of the NAFTA agreement. That would be terrible for the country. And in the NAFTA agreement, in this cold northern country, there's parts of it that say, you Canadians have got to continue selling us oil and gas on a pro rata basis, exactly the same ratio as you're selling us now, which is 65% of our oil and natural gas. And you can't cut back. Oh yeah, sorry, you can cut back. But if you cut back on your exports to us, you've got to cut back on your own Canadian consumption. And not only that, you can't charge us a penny more for the oil and gas than you charge your fellow Canadian citizens. Now, the Americans made that proposal to the Mexicans. You know what the Mexicans literally did? They laughed in their face. They said, you got to be kidding. We could never accept something like that. But our good old, brilliant Canadian negotiators signed that agreement, and we're stuck with the fact we can't charge Americans more for our natural resources, and we're stuck with the fact that we have to continue to share our natural resources on that overwhelming basis, whether we like it or not. In addition, in the NAFTA agreement, there's Chapter 11, I guess it is, whereby an American company can sue Canadian governments if it doesn't like what Canadian governments are doing. You know, you Canadian companies, governments, don't you even think about public automobile insurance, because it'll rob us of profits and we're going to sue you for every penny. Don't think for a minute of a national pharmacare program, because we might come along and sue you whether you like it or not. The possibility of Canadian governments now to have big, broad-scaled social programs because of this is really next to impossible in many, many cases because of that stupid Chapter 11. Good old NAFTA. There's one other thing. We were promised in full-page ads by big business that water was not a part of NAFTA. If you read my book, you'll find some leading experts on this subject say, as sure as we're here together today, the Americans are going to come to us and say, you have to start sharing your water with us, whether you like it or not.
Let's compare social and neoliberal models of oil development. Statoil is a nationalized resource, sold on the international market at competitive prices, at the same time protecting Norway's need for the resource. The government pension fund is the second largest pension fund in the world. Future supplies are protected. The oil sands are developed through the private sector, and the oil is sold at rock-bottom prices, primarily to the United States. National needs are abandoned. The Heritage Fund is undeveloped, and future supplies are unprotected.
I don't know if any of you have been on the prairies lately, but the prairie rivers are drying up. They're drying up because of the warming of the world. They drive between Banff and Jasper and see how the gorgeous glaciers have shrunk and are shrinking. And of course, they're not dumping water into the Bow River as much anymore. And then we brilliantly are taking the water in those rivers and we're using them for the oil sands.
As well as requiring 1 barrel of oil to make 2, oil sands plants use some 2 to 4 barrels of water to extract 1 barrel of oil, water which cannot be reused. Some extraction methods use as much as 7 barrels of water. The amount of water needed for the oil sands is seriously lowering water levels of the Athabasca River, the Mackenzie Valley watershed, and other related water sources.
Huge, massive quantities of water so that some of the most important rivers in Western Canada, draining into both Hudson Bay and into the Mackenzie Delta, their water flow is down by 30-40%, and it's going to go lower in the future. And needless to say, you know what's happening with the environment because of the oil sands. We're shipping all that stuff out to the States as quickly as we possibly can and digging up the earth as quickly as we possibly can.
The area covered by oil sands development will impact 23% of Alberta, a piece of pristine boreal forest the size of the state of Florida.
We're shipping all that stuff out to the States as quickly as we possibly can.
Of the 1.25 million barrels extracted daily from the sands, 1 million of it goes directly to the United States. There's no pipeline to Eastern Canada. Therefore, Eastern Canada has to import its oil, even though Canada is one of the richest oil-producing countries in the world. The oil sands industry is ensuring the energy security of the United States, while ignoring the energy needs of Canada. There is silence on these issues from our politicians. The Toronto Star of October 2006, David Olive writes, "In the past 2 years, more than a dozen of Canada's largest corporations, with total assets of more than $57 billion, have been swallowed by foreign predators." And the response has been, well, there really hasn't been a response. There are no calls in Parliament, any legislature, the media, or the halls of the academe for a Royal Commission on the consequences of our economic sovereignty from this unprecedented yard sale of Canadian industrial assets. Well, perhaps no Royal Commission, but the Competition Policy Review Panel, appointed by the federal government in 2007, issued its report in June 2008. Mr. Wilson, the chair of the panel, concludes that Canada must throw open the doors to foreign ownership in telecommunications, air travel, and uranium mining, and allow bank mergers, if it is to avoid falling farther behind in the global economy. Peter C. Newman takes a contrary view. He says only in Canada would a government-appointed commission with the mandate to report on what should be done about the hollowing out of the Canadian economy recommend that what we really need is to take down the very few and very feeble protections for the Canadian ownership of our vital sectors. Media and political responses to the report are disturbing, as they reflect a complete misunderstanding of the way in which a nation-state protects its resources and assets. By the way, what do Canadians think about NAFTA today? 46% think the U.S. benefited the most from NAFTA. 30% think Mexico did. 17% are unsure. Only 7% of Canadians believe Canada has been the prime beneficiary of NAFTA.
The same men who brought you the awful NAFTA agreement and the free trade agreement are right now meeting secretly, emphasize secretly, they hire public relations companies that tell the people who are attending how to avoid talking to the media. These meetings are going on right now. 15 American states are so concerned about them that they've gone to George W. Bush and said, wait a minute, this is going to rob us of our sovereignty. This is going to put big business in control of our future. We should be getting out of this. Do you think there's any one single member of the Harper government that would ever say anything like that? Well, of course, the answer is no. Nobody knows who paid for these meetings. Nobody knows who sponsored them, and they're being held in secret. Well, I sent these details of these meetings out to the press. I sent it out to Global Television and to the CBC Television and to CTV Television. I sent it out to the Globe and Mail. I sent it out to the National Post. I sent it out to the CanWest newspapers, they weren't interested. Meetings to integrate Canada into the United States with so many famous people attending, they were not interested in the story. What does that tell you about the media in this country?
The Security and Prosperity Initiative was launched by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives in 2003. Proponents argue that the SPI, also known as the North American Union, an extension of NAFTA, is necessary in order to compete with emerging China and the European Union. They also maintain that such a union must be secured against terrorist attacks. The North American Competitive Council was established in 2006. Corporate members, along with their Mexican counterparts, have a direct influence on government policy. Without any media coverage, public forum, or consultation with environmental, social, or labor groups. The North American Union is an understanding of intent, not a legal document. As such, its fusion of corporate military interests constitutes an end run around democracy. Our prime ministers have attended secretive North American Union meetings wherein the press was not allowed and no substantive statements were issued. In August of 2007, Harper, Bush, and Calderon meet in Montebello, Quebec,
and again in New Orleans in 2008, again with no media coverage.
But that's not all. There are also secretive provincial regional agreements. In the West, the Trade, Investment, and Labor Mobility Agreement allows corporations and individuals to sue provincial governments for any government measure they feel restricts profits. Other provinces and some U.S. states are also interested in signing on. In the East, Atlantica aims to create a massive binational trading bloc where wages are lower, unions smaller, and regulations protecting our health and environment are weaker. All of these agreements, the lack of any public discussion or immediate debate, stresses the reality that it is citizens versus governments in the New World Order. This sellout of Canada by our own leaders is without precedent and without question the most shameful period in our history. If the North American Union succeeds, Canada will forfeit its sovereignty without a whimper. The end result of these free trade agreements, that is, the gutting of the Canadian manufacturing sector, the loss of financial and other institutions to foreign owners, and the loss of control over our own resources and governing powers, is apparently what the corporate sector wants. At best, this will weaken the Canadian economy to such an extent that it will never be able to flourish. At worst, it will lead to a balkanization, or indeed, even the end of Canada as a nation-state. This dissolution will likely be carefully controlled by a corporate media spin. It may be interpreted as a natural process in a globalized world.
I did my best to publicize it. I sent the stuff to Peter Newman, and Peter Newman did his best as well, and he came back to me, he said, Mel, I sent this stuff to people I trust, and people who trust me, and they wouldn't give me a single word. And he said, if this isn't a conspiracy, I don't know what is. Now, these people are still meeting from time to time, and these meetings, there's about 30 different sectoral committees meeting right now, and they are talking about the very future of your country. I hope you'll forgive me for what I'm about to say, because some of you will be friends of his. But I found that Paul Martin was one of the biggest hypocrites I've ever seen in Ottawa. He talked and talked about poverty in Canada and talked about poverty in the world. And one of the things he did is drop our GDP percentage of foreign aid down from about 46% down to 22%. Well, Canada is now, of the 24 donor nations, I think we're 17th now in terms of our foreign aid, far below what it used to be. We're 36th now, by the way, in peacekeeping. There isn't one single Canadian officer in peacekeeping headquarters in the United Nations. If you read the Globe and Mail 2 or 3 days ago, you saw a big for-all about the fact that Canada is thinking of withdrawing its application to become one of the new members of the Security Council. Germany wants to, and Portugal wants to, and Canada wants to as well. And why are they thinking of withdrawing this? I mean, they gave notice in 2001 that we were going to apply to be a new member of the Security Council. Why are they thinking of withdrawing? Well, because around the world, men like Jeffrey Sachs, the brilliant economist, are saying, where's Canada now? We used to look to you for leadership. Where are you in things like the weaponization of space? Where are you in foreign aid? Where are you on Kyoto and the environment? And where are you in a long, long list of other things? Why would they want to elect Canada as a member of the Security Council? Well, that's one of the main things that this book is all about, is how our country has changed.
As to Canada in Afghanistan, the Canadian Senate Defense Committee's recent report claims that the war in Afghanistan cannot be won. Canada's military presence has made the lives of Afghan citizens worse, not better. Advances in women's rights, democracy, and education are not happening, as Afghanistan does not want to be rebuilt in Canada's image. Astonishingly, in light of these facts, the Defense Committee recommended that defense spending should increase to $25 billion and to $35 billion by 2012.
Let us look to the 2008 federal budget. This is the summary statement of transactions. Note the public debt charges. These amounts, in billions of dollars, year after year after year, are merely the interest payments on the federal debt listed just below. You'll notice the interest payments do not drop significantly over the years. We are paying in perpetuity, forever. One expert sums it up nicely. The very idea of a government that can create money for itself, allowing banks to create money that the government then borrows and pays interest on, is so preposterous it staggers the imagination. The argument that using national banks to create money would cause inflation is nonsense. Inflation would only occur if our economy were already employing all available resources. Were the national bank to go on increasing its lending to governments, under such circumstances it would indeed be inflationary. But such a state of affairs has not existed, at least in Canada, for decades. Canadians should be outraged by this annual redirection, theft actually, of their tax dollars into the coffers of the global financial community, rather than into social programs for the benefit of Canadians. This too is a very unpleasant truth about the power of greed in Canada in bed with global financial interests.
Who killed Canada?
Well, we have considered a number of likely suspects. Perhaps we are a casualty of the marketplace or of higher global financial interests. Ursula Franklin sums it up well.
We are being occupied by marketeers, just as the French and Norwegians were occupied by the Germans. We have, as they did, puppet governments who run the country for the benefit of the occupiers. We have, as they did, collaborators. We are, as they were, threatened by deliberate willfulness by people who have only contempt for those they occupy and who see their mission to turn over our territory to their masters.
Who killed Canada? Our political leaders are certainly highly suspect. The media? Or the radical right in Canada with their Neanderthal institutes and friends? We've seen the adverse effects of ongoing free trade deals. Perhaps an ideology, neoliberalism, has done us in. Multinational corporations, too, are one of the usual suspects. Even you and I are suspects for not speaking out, for not getting involved.
0.75% of adult Canadians made a donation to any political party in the 2006 federal election. 80% of adult Canadians have never belonged to any political party. Our voter turnout rate is about 90th now among democracies. At the provincial level and at the federal level, it's been going straight downhill. Now, and the turnout rate for young people at universities, 25% in the last two federal elections. Stelmach made this huge sweep in Alberta that was broadcast all over the place. He got support from 22% of the eligible voters.
In the 2006 federal election, how popular was Stephen Harper? He was elected by only 36.3% of the popular vote. If you don't want him in office, get out and vote for someone else in the next election. The truth about Canada is that she is fading away. As mentioned earlier, under present circumstances, the death of Canada will likely be carefully controlled by corporate media spin, packaged by the radical right in Canada, sold to citizens by politicians, and housed in a variety of so-called free trade agreements. Here's a 4-point revitalization program for Canada. 1. Economic reform. Freeze all Canadian Security and Prosperity Partnership activities subject to full public disclosure and debate. Curtail foreign takeovers of Canadian corporations, and establish a Royal Commission on banking practices in Canada. 2. On poverty. Expand social programs. Raise corporate taxes, and preserve universal health care. 3. The environment. Nationalize the oil sands. Bear in mind that 90% of other countries do so. And create provincial Kyoto bonds to be purchased by the Bank of Canada to subsidize compliance with the Kyoto Protocol. For parliamentary reform, have mixed member proportional representation, as most other countries do.
We desperately need a mixed member proportional representation system. Our current system is so out of whack with the wishes of the people. You get the Green Party getting 650,000 votes and electing not a single member of Parliament. You get the Bloc getting 650,000 votes and electing 21 members of Parliament. And the chapter on democracy, which I think is the most important chapter in this book, explains why it would be so much better to do like 80 other democracies have done and move towards a mixed member proportional system.
But under current circumstances, proportional representation, as well as the rest of the revitalization plan just considered, will likely be virtually ignored.
Our wayward leaders seem to be going in circles, lost in silly squabbles, controlled by the radical right and a dysfunctional neoliberalism which now prevails in every area of our society. The Honourable Paul Hellyer, Deputy Prime Minister of Canada in the Trudeau government, puts it this way: I tried to find a nicer word than treason to describe what is going on, but to no avail. It is time to let our politicians and the experts who advise them know in no uncertain terms that we hold them accountable for their unforgivable negligence. It is doubtful that any of the issues raised in this program will be debated in the 2008 federal election campaign. The death of Canada will therefore proceed on course according to anti-Canadian neoliberal policies, the radical right agenda in Canada, and the completion of the never talked about Security and Prosperity Partnership. This video should make you angry, outraged by the unbelievable, cowardly mix of incompetence and arrogance which is killing Canada, and in so doing, destroying your prospects and those of your children and grandchildren for a stable, secure, and relatively content future in this great, beautiful land.
I love David Suzuki's foundation. I love the Sierra Club. I love the Council of Canadians, and et cetera, et cetera. The only way you can do something really important if you're concerned about the welfare of your children and your grandchildren and want them to stay Canadians is to go out and get directly involved in the political process. Now, we fail to teach our young people in this country, both at the high school level and at the early years of university, how important it is to get involved in politics. And, and if they don't get involved in politics, it leaves politics up to the big law firms and the big oil companies and the big accountant companies, etc. And that's been a major failure of ours, failing to teach young people to go out and get involved in politics. Oh, Canada.